Samantha Hilgenberg. I'm representing the Neosho FFA chapter in the Missouri Cattlemen speech. The title of my speech is Eminent Domain and How It Affects the Cattle Industry. I would like for you to take a journey with me and come visit my dairy farm. This is your typical dairy farm. Old, white, two-story house, barns that should have been torn down years ago but are still functioning, a tractor that would be condemned by most mechanics, Holstein cows who are anxiously awaiting to be milked, a farm dog, and my family. This is my life. I hope to one day take this farm over from my father, just like he took it over from my grandfather and his before. This farm has been in my family for 70+ years. Can you picture it? Can you smell the parlor? Now imagine this. It was a normal evening on the farm. I just finished milking 64 Holsteins and was cleaning the parlor when I heard a knock on the front door of the house. It was two individuals dressed in suits. As I greeted them, they handed me an envelope that was addressed to my father. Inside was a letter explaining how they wanted to buy my family's land to build a new manufacturing warehouse and would like to settle on a price agreement. How would you feel? What emotions would be going through your mind? This process that includes taking your land or someone else's for the purpose of something greater is called eminent domain, and it is a real threat to farmers today. Eminent domain is defined as a right of a government to take private property for public use by virtue of the superior dominion of the sovereign power over all lands within its jurisdiction. That was a mouthful. If you're like me and not a lawyer, it sounds very complicated. However, this boils down to a more simple explanation. If the government thinks that your land, meaning location or resources, can be put to a better use for the public interest, then they can take it from you, as long as they offer you money for your land, also known as compensation. But obviously, most people don't want to sell their land. Unfortunately, farmers in this situation don't have much of a choice when it comes to eminent domain. According to Legal Match June 25th, 2018, there are several steps involved with eminent domain. The first step a government agency has to do to obtain your property is to make contact to express interest. Once you are informed that the government is interested in your property, then the government then has to schedule a date for appraisal of your property. After the appraisal, you are given a copy and an offer will be made for your land. Once the offer is made, a public trial has to be held so that the government can show how your property is necessary for a public project, will be the greatest benefit to the public, and show that they have made an offer to you. After showing all the information above, an eminent domain case will be filed in the court. Before the case is heard, appraisers will be obtained to help determine the fair market value of the property. Appraisals will be exchanged and you have the opportunity to settle. If you choose not to settle, a jury will be used to determine the fair market value. After the case, the government has 30 days to pay you. And in those 30 days, the title to your property will be transferred to the government. I understand what you're thinking. Eminent domain, what does this have to do with the cattle industry? Let me provide you with a couple examples of how eminent domain has affected the cattle industry. The first example is about a family in Iowa when the route of the Dakota Access Pipeline affected their precious farmland. Keith Brink, an Iowa farmer, and his family has farmed the same ground near Oskaloosa, Iowa for the past 4 generations. The purpose of the Dakota Access Pipeline was to carry oil from North Dakota to the refineries in Illinois. This pipeline was to travel approximately 350 miles through 18 of Iowa's highly productive farmland counties. To voice his concern, Mr. Brink said the following words during an interview with Successful Farming, Inc. "The pipeline didn't bother me until it was going through 2 of my best fields." I think that's how you feel about everything in life. It doesn't bother you until it affects you. As an agricultural community, we need to care before eminent domain affects us. Let me provide you with another example that hits closer to home, literally. To the north of my hometown of Neosho, Missouri, there is an eminent domain case for a water reservoir. The Missouri American Water Company, housed in Joplin, has concerns about the future of the potable water for Joplin, Missouri residents. In 2012, Missouri American Water came within 12 hours of having to enact mandatory conservation measures due to low flows on Shoal Creek. This prompted the company to decide to find an alternative water source to meet the needs of Joplin residents. After much efforts, their best idea was to build a dam near Shoal Creek and flood the low-lying lands to create the needed sustainable water supply. They started canvassing the areas around Shoal Creek and finally landed on a location near northern Newton County. The next step in the process was to buy the land from Newton County farmers. However, most farmers were not on the same page as Missouri American Water. They did not want to sell their land. Most of these farms were generational farms and planned to keep it that way. When I interviewed Shane Dawkins, a Newton County beef producer, he shared with me his frustration with how eminent domain will affect how they raise and produce beef. Missouri American Water would like to purchase nearly half of Mr. Dawkins' farm, almost 200 acres, and flood it for the reservoir. This particular land, Mr. Dawkins states, is the home base of their operation, with barns, corrals, and miles of new fence. If Missouri American Water moves forward with their plans to flood the low-lying lands, then this will force Mr. Dawkins, his family, and his farming operation to relocate. Although relocation may sound like the simple solution, it is rather complex when you're talking about a farming operation. Mr. Dawkins also shared with me a story about his grandfather. His grandfather was born and raised on a successful farm, but decided to give it up about 15 years ago with the intentions of buying the land they currently farm and building a generational farm. Mr. Dawkins says that the hardest part with this battle with Missouri American Water was witnessing his grandfather experience this. His grandfather had worked tirelessly and dedicated his entire life to this farm, just to have it stripped away by a private company. Although there are not many solutions to eminent domain, there is something that we can do. We need to advocate with our elected officials to develop standards. These standards would allow for landowners to have the authority to set the asking price for their land, just as if they were to sell it to their neighbor. Luckily for me, my story about our dairy farm being stripped away from us was just a figure of my imagination. I still love and live on our dairy farm and would be devastated if the farm is sold. However, for many like Mr. Dawkins, this story is very true. We must unite together as farmers, ranchers, and agriculturalists to support each other through hardships and turmoil. Because if we don't, we'll be asking ourselves the same question that Mr. Brink asked. If farmers don't have a choice and continue to give in, what will be left for the next generation?